schau noch mal, was passiert, so ein bisschen, wenn wir den Eimer noch ein paar Stellen mitnehmen.
All of his co-workers were gone. What could it mean? Stanley decided to go to the meeting room. Perhaps he had simply missed a memo. Stanley lifted the bucket into his arms, and a wave of comfort rushed over him.
So, ich guck nur mal.
Stanley clutched the bucket tightly to his chest and entered the door.
Wenn wir jetzt wieder zu der Mind Control Facility gehen, was passiert, wenn wir den Zerstörungsknopf quasi wieder drücken? Mit unserem Eimer in der Hand. Den wir nicht an das Broom Closet
Coming to a
übergeben.
staircase, Stanley and the bucket walked upstairs to the boss's office.
Jo. Weiß ich alles.
Stepping into his manager's office, Stanley was once again stunned to discover not an indication of any human life. Crushed, but Stanley guessed the correct code by sheer luck. Was it that the bucket knew all along? Was the bucket guiding him?
Ah, ich mag den Eimer.
This is certainly the most logical explanation.
So. Ich gehe nochmal verschiedene Entscheidungen durch mit dem Eimer. Vielleicht schneide ich das auch ein bisschen dann zusammen. Je nachdem. Es gibt ja auch immer neue Dialoge dann mit Eimer. Für die anderen Endings ja auch.
Stanley and the bucket walked straight ahead through the large door that read Mind Control Facility.
Das machen wir noch eben.
The lights rose on an enormous room packed with television screens. What horrible secret did this place hold? Stanley and the bucket both wondered to themselves.
Ich finde es einfach immer noch toll, dass der Eimer wirklich in die Geschichte mit eingefügt wird. So richtig. Der hat Agency, der hat eine Persönlichkeit.
And Stanley nearly dropped the bucket in shock. Everyone in the office was being videotaped, monitored like guinea pigs. The bucket had never seen anything like this, and it very nearly burst into tears as Stanley cradled it gently, reassuring it that everything would be fine.
Ich habe irgendwie gerade das Bedürfnis, mir zu Hause einen Eimer zu suchen und ihn zu umarmen.
Was the bucket under the mind control facility's influence as well? Had the bucket been told to do things it didn't wish to do? What kinds of things does a bucket want to do or not want to do in the first place? These questions raced furiously in Stanley's feeble mind. No! He screamed into the bucket. He couldn't accept it. His own life in someone else's control? Never! He squeezed the bucket tighter. His one friend in the entire world. At this point, he could trust no one except for the bucket. But here was the proof. The heart of the operation. Controls labeled with emotions, happy or sad or content. Walking, eating, working, all of it monitored and commanded from this very place. And as the cold reality of his past began to sink in, Stanley decided that this machinery would never again exert its terrible power over another human life. For he and the bucket would dismantle the controls for good. Two best friends, Stanley and the bucket, up against the world. They high-fived in a really cool way, and the bucket made a sassy comment about taking down the system.
Aber wir machen das genaue Gegenteil.
But at the last second, the bucket jumped in and pressed the button to turn on the controls. Stanley gasped in horror. Had this been the bucket's plan all along? To take over the machine and claim the power for itself? How could the bucket have betrayed him like this?
Nein, nicht mal
Stanley
Eimer.
was prepared to throw the bucket away in disgust when suddenly an image appeared upon the enormous screen. Birds. Silly, silly birds. The control buttons became active again.
Wie? Warum?
Stanley flipped through one video of silly birds after another, and then it dawned on him. This wasn't a mind control facility at all. It was a facility for monitoring and surveilling silly birds all over the world.
Ja,
The mind
genau.
controls were only a facade to disguise its true intentions. Had the bucket known this all along? Stanley marveled at the metal genius in his hands, the one who had pointed him towards this incredible discovery. Stanley and the bucket never found freedom because they spent the rest of their lives here in this place, flipping through live streams of the silliest birds imaginable. Of all the possible paths his life could have taken, this one was surely the best. And Stanley was happy.
Ja, lustige Vögelvideos gucken auf YouTube. Was macht man sonst nachts um 3? Aber wie gut einfach die Endings wirklich komplett anders sind, wenn man den Eimer dabei hat.
All of his co-workers were gone. What could it mean? Stanley decided to go to
alles
the
noch mal
meeting
neu
room.
machen
The
hier.
confusion and the chaos all seemed to melt away as Stanley embraced the bucket. Stanley clutched the bucket tightly to his chest and entered the door on his left.
Ja, Statuen fehlen uns auch noch ein paar. Aber ich mache nochmal das Escape-Ending jetzt mit Eimer. Mal gucken, was da passiert.
Coming to a staircase, Stanley and the bucket walked upstairs to the boss's office. Stepping into his manager's
wieder den
office,
Code
Stanley was once again
reinschmeißen.
stunned to discover not an indication of any
5.
human life.
So,
But
Eimer
Stanley
hat den
guessed the
Code
correct
gewusst.
code by sheer luck. Was it that the bucket knew all along?
Ja.
Was the bucket guiding him?
Ja, ich bin der Eimer.
This is certainly the most logical explanation.
Hier sitzt kein Mensch und spielt und Let's Play das Spiel. Ich bin tatsächlich ein Stahleimer. Ja, ich identifiziere mich ab jetzt als Stahleimer. So möchte ich bitte auch angesprochen werden. So, jetzt bin ich
Stanley
mal
and the bucket
gespannt.
walked straight ahead through the large door that read Mind Control Facility. Although this passageway had the word escape written on it, the truth was that at the end of this hall, Stanley and the bucket would both meet a violent death.
Und für meinen armen Eimer würde ich es mir fast noch
The
mal
door
überlegen,
behind them was
umzukehren.
not shut. Stanley and the bucket still had every opportunity to turn around and get back on track. At this point, Stanley and the bucket were knowingly walking forward into a very painful death for each of them.
Ja, so. Geronimo. Bei irgendeinem Ende durften wir auch seinen Eimer ja nicht mitnehmen. Ich weiß schon gar nicht mehr, bei welchem, ehrlich gesagt. Merke ich dann. Kann ich meinen Eimer mit zu meiner Freundin mit nach
As
Hause
the
nehmen?
machine whirred into motion and Stanley and the bucket inched closer to their demise, Stanley reflected on how meaningless the bucket's warmth and comfort had turned out to be.
Nein.
To be sure, it puts the mind and the soul at ease to embrace the bucket. But what use is a sense of ease when you're about to be crushed to death? This is what Stanley thought to himself, and he sort of kicked himself for wasting so much time carrying a bucket everywhere.
Ich mag
Farewell,
meinen
Stanley.
Eimer. Tschüss, Eimer.
"Farewell, Stanley," cried the narrator, as Stanley and the bucket were led helplessly into the enormous metal jaws. In a single visceral instant, the bucket's life came to an end, as it was crushed
War nicht mal mehr
violently
meins,
to
sondern
death.
wirklich nur noch der Eimer. Okay, ich zähle schon gar nichts mehr. Es geht nur noch um den Eimer. Könnten es auch die
It was a
Bucket-Parabel umnennen.
shame, the death of such a magnificent bucket. It's true that all buckets are radiant in their own way, but this one stood above the rest. It was a glorious bucket to behold.
Danke. Ich fühle mich sehr wertgeschätzt. Der Eimer heißt Sie willkommen zur großen Ausstellung. Sie stehen am Abgrund des Wissens. Ähnlich wie ein Eimer ist auch der menschliche Verstand oft leer. Eine höhlenartige Leere. Aber durch die Absorption des Ausstellungsstücks vor ihnen wird der Geist voll, bereichert und fundiert. Die Kenntnisse über den Eimer und seine Geschichte sind das einzig wahre Wissen, das wir wirklich haben. Werden Sie das, was Sie hier lernen, mitten in die Welt hinausnehmen? Werden Sie aufgeschlossen akzeptieren, was an den Informationen in dieser Ausstellung herausfordernd sein mag? Werden Sie das Leben von sich selbst und Ihren Liebsten als Folge dieser Ausstellung verändern? Oder werden Sie die Augen verschließen und weiterleben wie bisher in Unwissenheit und Dunkelheit? Kommt auf die Ausstellung drauf an, würde ich sagen.
Can you see how arrogant it was for Stanley to take a bucket like this and to claim it for his own? Can you see the hubris that blinded him? Can you see that the bucket is far more noble than Stanley will ever be in his short life?
Fühle mich sehr gedisst. 25 Eimer, ich würde mal behaupten, es sind mehr als 25 Eimer. Eine Fotografie von 25 Eimern, die größte Anzahl an Eimern, die jemals von einer Kamera erfasst wurde. Der Fotograf erlitt mehrere Wochen lang einen katatonischen Schock aufgrund der Euphorie, die er beim Anblick von so vieler Eimer auf einmal empfand. Gucke ich lieber nicht zu lange hin, nicht, dass ich hier auch noch irgendwelche Schocks erleide. Ein Eimer mit 2 Henkeln. Dieser Eimer ist mit 2 Henkeln abgebildet. Eine solche Konstruktion wurde in der Realität nie hergestellt, da sie als zu gefährlich und waghalsig experimentell eingestuft wurde. Jedes Jahr werden Dutzende hingerichtet, nur weil sie es versucht haben. Okay. Inferno-Eimer, eine Nachbildung des Inferno-Eimers, der im Mittelalter eine so große Anziehungskraft ausübte, dass Dutzende von Nationen gegeneinander Krieg führten, um die Kontrolle über ihn zu erlangen. Milliarden von Menschen starben und trotz allem bleibt die einfache Tatsache bestehen. Niemand kann einen Eimer kontrollieren. Der Stresseimer, ohne Kommentar. The Stress Bucket, an Analogy. Worrying, Negative Forecasting, Negative Thinking, Lack of Reassurance. Also alle negativen Gedanken und Dinge kommen in den Eimer rein. Und deine Verwundbarkeit ist gleich die Größe und Stärke des Eimers. Und der Stress ist, wie viel Wasser in dem Eimer ist. Und die Coping-Strategien sind Löcher. Und dadurch lässt man das Wasser aus dem Eimer raus. Irgendwie hat's was. Irgendwo ist da was Wahres dran, tatsächlich. Ich habe auch meinen Eimer gar nicht mehr in der Hand, merke ich gerade. Nein! Höhlenmalerei. Wir wissen zwar, dass es Eimer schon vor der Existenz der Menschheit gab, aber wir wissen nicht, wie lange zuvor. Diese Höhlenzeichnung zeigt, wie der frühe Mensch den praktischen Nutzen des Eimers entdeckte. Zu diesem Zeitpunkt gab es den Eimer wahrscheinlich schon seit mehreren Jahrtausenden. Auf diesen Zeichnungen ist zu sehen, wie der Eimer die Benutzung seiner selbst zulässt, nachdem er die Menschheit für würdig befunden hat, seine Schätze zu nutzen. Wie geil! Dass die sich halt auch überlegt haben für die Ultra Deluxe Edition, was können wir machen, um das Spiel noch besser zu machen? Und irgendwer kam...
No man can own a bucket, and certainly not a bucket as dazzling to behold as this one. It is man who should kneel before the bucket.
Mhm. Ja, irgendwer von den Entwicklern dachte sich dann, was wir brauchen, ist ein Eimer. Und das ist der geilste Eimer, den wir je gesehen haben. Und wir beten diesen Eimer einfach an. Und es funktioniert einfach. Diese Idee ist so absonderlich, so abstrus, aber so geil. Warum haben nicht mehr Spiele einfach einen Eimer? Der hängende Eimer. Dieses Stück symbolisiert die notwendige Beziehung zwischen Eimer und Menschheit. Wie klar unser Verständnis des Eimers auch sein mag, es gibt noch mehr, das stets außerhalb unserer Reichweite liegt. Dieser Abstand ist unweigerlich zu unserem eigenen Besten. Ah, I see what you did there. Aber ich möchte den Abstand verringern. Ich muss zu dem Eimer. Oh. Eimer. Ich kann zu dem Eimer. Ich dachte, ich falle jetzt runter.
But there is something we can do. Something we can do together, you and I, that will right this terrible wrong. Let Stanley die. Let him be crushed by the machine. Don't reset the game. Don't give him another opportunity to run off with another beautiful bucket. We can save the world's buckets from their treatment as tools and implements if only we let Stanley die together. The bucket shall take its place as ruler, as leader, as commander of a new world.
Kein Bucket Easter Egg hier im Menü, okay.
A new vision for...
Da wie gut einfach. dass die sich wirklich nochmal extra Eimer-Endings ausgedacht haben. Ich meine, das hier können wir mit dem Eimer nicht machen, weil wir dafür ja in unserem Büro sein müssen und die Tür geht ja zu, sobald wir rausgehen. Also das
Just a
Ende mit den
step through this door, Stanley
Knöpfen
thought
geht
to
nicht.
himself, that's all I need. If I can make it through this door, I can make it through them all.
Ja, das
Warmth
hättest du wohl gerne.
spread through Stanley's arms. With the bucket in his arms again, he was home.
Ist auch ein neuer Dialog, glaube ich, ne?
Stanley clutched the bucket tightly to his chest and entered the door on his left.
Können wir mit dem Eimer die Treppe nach unten gehen, wo wir wahnsinnig werden? Was passiert dann? Bin gespannt.
Coming to a staircase, Stanley and the bucket walked upstairs to the boss's office.
Nope, Stanley and the bucket are going downstairs.
But Stanley just couldn't do it. He considered the possibility of facing his boss, admitting he had left his post during work hours. He might be fired for that. And in such a competitive economy, why had he taken that risk? All because he believed everyone had vanished? His boss would think he was crazy.
Wie,
And
soweit
then
ist es noch das
something
Gleiche?
occurred to Stanley. Maybe, he thought to himself, maybe
Sind
I
wir
am
verrückt, weil wir
crazy.
den Eimer zum
He
besten
looked down
Freund
at the
haben?
bucket in his arms. Am I crazy? He asked the bucket. The bucket returned his gaze, but said nothing at all. That's strange, Stanley thought. Usually the bucket is a source of guidance and wisdom for me in difficult times such as these. He held the bucket close, yet felt none of its familiar reassurance and comfort. And that's when Stanley realized, this isn't my bucket. It's just a normal, everyday bucket. Someone else's
Nein.
bucket, perhaps. How did I end up with someone else's bucket? This is all terribly wrong. Surely no good would come from this. Who
Eimer.
knows what sorts of bizarre hallucinations Stanley might experience without the psychologically grounding presence of his bucket. And indeed, now he noticed that the rooms were repeating, which was, of course,
Wer
very
hat mir meinen
odd.
Eimer weggenommen?
And now he felt himself floating off the ground. Oh, gracious, he exclaimed. Without my bucket, I've gone truly mad. Where is it? I must find it.
Ja.
Far off in the distance now, he heard it, calling to him.
Stanley, Stanley, it's me, the bucket.
Could it
Ich
truly
komme,
be?
Eimer.
He rushed forward from room to room, passing by one bucket after the next. None of them were his. None of them were his special bucket.
Come to me, Stanley, find me.
He had to find the bucket. He had to return to his old friend. It was the only way to truly restore his sanity. And then suddenly, he froze dead in his tracks. He knew where the voice of the bucket had been coming from. The real bucket was inside of him all along.
Was?
It was incredibly painful. Stanley doubled over in agony and blacked out. This is the story of a woman named Mariella. Mariella woke up on a day like any other. She arose, got dressed, picked up her bucket of comfort and security, and walked to her place of work. But on this particular day, her walk was interrupted by the body of a man who had
Eimer
stumbled
dabei.
through town, talking and screaming to himself, and then collapsed dead on the sidewalk. Right away, she knew what the problem was. This man had no bucket.
Ja.
Of course he'd gone mad, ranting and raving about a narrator describing all of his actions and how everything is predetermined and free will is an illusion and it's all just a video game. It could all have been prevented if only he'd taken his bucket with him. Perhaps he didn't even realize he'd forgotten his bucket at home in the first place. How cruel the world can be, Mariella thought, and she hugged her own bucket even tighter. But of course, she had no time for this. There were a myriad of confusing problems she would soon have to confront at work, for which her bucket would provide absolute guidance and total clarity on everything. Heck yes, she thought to herself, my life kicks ass. And she backflipped all the way to work.
Backflipped all the way to work. Ah, wieso? Boah, das ist so gut mit dem Eimer. Ich wette, seit das Spiel draußen ist, sind die Verkäufe von Eimern überall auf der Welt einfach angestiegen. Ich wette, so viele Leute kaufen sich jetzt noch so einen Metalleimer. Sogar ich habe irgendwie gefühlt das Bedürfnis, mir so einen Eimer zu kaufen. Das ist die beste Eimer-Werbung, die sich hätten ausdenken können.
All of his co-workers. Stanley picked up the bucket and smiled. He'd never be alone again, not truly alone. Stanley clutched the bucket tightly to his chest and entered
haben
the
wir
door
links
on
noch
his
was zu
left.
tun? Ich glaube, wir waren links größtenteils überall, soweit es mir
This was not the
einfällt.
correct way to the meeting room, but Stanley had felt the bucket calling to him, telling him that the employee lounge was simply the place to be.
Oh ja, wir müssen einmal die Lounge zeigen, die kennt er noch gar
And here
nicht.
it was. Had the bucket turned out to be correct?
Ja.
Was this better than the meeting room?
Ja.
Yes, Stanley thought to himself. Yes, perhaps it truly was. How insightful the bucket turned out to be.
Ja, danke Eimer. Hast du toll gemacht. Kommt hier noch was, wenn wir wieder hier ein bisschen länger rumchillen?
Truly, being here with the bucket was a grand adventure. Stanley reflected on all they'd been through together. First, walking through the door on the right. Then walking to the lounge. Then arriving at the lounge. What a thrilling journey the bucket had inspired. No, never mind. The bucket was wrong. Stanley took the door on his left to go back to the meeting room.
Nein.
No,
Said the bucket.
don't go to the meeting room. Go somewhere else. The cargo lift, yes. Go there. Go to the cargo lift.
Braucht das Collectible.
You're getting close now, Stanley. You've nearly gotten all of the Figler Anmarines. Very soon, you'll collect the last one, and then the first number will equal the second number, and that will be it. We'll be different people by then. Different in the sense that we used to have none of them, and now we have them all. You can't go back to when you had no Figler Anmarines. None of us can.
Aber es ist einfach so wahr. Man hat halt einfach keinen Mehrwert davon, aber dieses kleine bisschen Endorphine, was man bekommt, wenn man eine findet, das ist es doch schon wert. Wie ist denn jetzt? Bin ich hier? Ich habe immerhin meinen Eimer dabei, der passt auf mich auf. Oder Kassettentapes? Kassettentapes mit Narrator-Dialog. Okay, ich muss hier dann ohne Eimer auch nochmal hin, glaube ich. Das ist neu. Evidence.
Okay, this is day number 295. Tape number... I don't even know. I've lost track. Nothing feels real anymore. The longer I study this bucket, the less sense anything makes. The sheer euphoria I feel every time I pick it up. No matter how many times I've done it, it's always the same feeling. And the emptiness in my chest when I set it down. It doesn't make sense. There's no explanation for it. I still haven't figured out why I see the world so differently when this bucket is in my arms. Why everything feels so... What do I do with this treasure? I can monetize it. Yes. It's unthinkable the amounts of money people will pay for even just an hour with the bucket. This is my golden ticket. But I have to be careful, because as soon as this gets out, there's going to be a target on my back. Even now, I don't know who might be trying to get... What's that? Who's there?
Bitte was? Was war das denn? Okay. Okay, ich muss das nochmal gerade eben ohne den Eimer machen.
Stanley had never seen the office this brightly lit. Was it a sign of something? He hoped it was. He hoped very much that it was.
Wahrscheinlich nicht. Bis jetzt hat sich noch nicht viel geändert, sonst normalerweise. Ich muss dann nochmal hin ohne den Eimer.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, this was not the correct way to the meeting room, and Stanley knew it perfectly well.
Ja, ich weiß.
Perhaps he wanted to stop by the employee lounge first, just to admire it.
Na, durch die renne ich auch nur mal durch.
And here it
ausnahmsweise.
was, the lounge. What a room, Stanley thought to himself. What a room, what a room, what a room. This is what Stanley thought. What a room. What a room, what a room. What a room. Va-va-voom. What a room.
Okay, der verliert
But
langsam ein bisschen
eager to
seinen
get back
Verstand.
to business,
Er ist ja nur
Stanley
neidisch
took the
auf unser
first
Verhältnis
open
mit
door on
dem,
his left.
mit der Lounge.
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
Er ist ja nur neidisch, dass wir die Lounge lieber mögen als ihn.
Stanley had now gotten himself so far off the beaten path that it seemed the office had begun. So far off the beaten path that it seemed the office had begun. So far off the beaten path that it seemed the office had begun. So far off the beaten path that it seemed the office had begun. So far off the beaten path that it seemed the office had begun. So far off the beaten path that it seemed the office. You didn't think I was actually just a recording, did you? What a silly and trite explanation that would be. All the back and forth between you and me, all the absurd adventures we've been through, and it all turns out I'm just a tape recording? It was all just in Stanley's head. I bet that's the kind of twist you think is revelatory. I bet each and every time you watch a movie where it turns out all to be in the main character's imagination, you must absolutely bolt off the couch in pure shock at the phenomenal and intricate storytelling. It must be so simple to be you. Life being an unending waterfall of surprises and delights. How much more exciting you must find the world than the rest of us do. Now I've become sad. Look what you've done to me. This is all your fault.
Tja, wie immer. Immer ist alles meine Schuld.